Once they start understanding what it is and the capability, the first thing that pops in their heads is, how do we align our physical contracts, our paper-based commercial regulation, our paper-based incorporation documents to this digital world? And what's the right approach to do that? They don't want to set the regulations on blockchain because, quite frankly, they now understand that it doesn't stop at their state border. But they want to be able to enable it so as people do innovative things on blockchain, there's a commercial legal construct that's aligned to it. And I'm finding that's true whether it's been in Arkansas or Oklahoma or Kansas or Iowa. They're all looking at doing that. Same thing in places like Wyoming and Colorado. Being driven by business associations, whether it's the Cattlemen's Association in Wyoming or the rice growers in Arkansas or the people growing soybeans and wheat in Iowa. Those large grower cooperatives are putting pressure on the legislature to basically say, give us a legal construct so as we start doing stuff on blockchain, whether it's smart contracts or payments or whatever it is, we don't find what we spent the past 5 years doing thrown out by some judge because he doesn't understand the technology. And that's where they see it heading. U.S. Congress, I have no hope for. unlike my senior VP.
Is that a general statement, Dennis?
Yes. Unlike my senior VP, Jerry Cuomo, who has spent a lot of time in front of Congress, I have very little hope that Congress can actually legislate forward. They will always legislate backwards.
They're reactive.
It will be reactive at best, reactionary typically. And
is that also your sense with regulators?
Other than the FDA, yes. I think the FDA is now in the position that public pressure will actually force them to adopt what the industry groups are doing on their own. I mean, Romaine's been a fiasco, and it's going to force things. They've brought Frank Yanis in from Walmart to go put that stuff in place. They're now asking, how come blockchain for pharmaceuticals isn't as far as blockchain for food is? And I see that happening from public pressure. The FDA will react more to public pressure than to congressional oversight. That's what I tend to see.
I think the statement that's going to stick is, you have no faith in legislators. But
yes.
That takes us to, well, we'd love your questions. There must be at least one question from all morning. That's Nick right there.
On the back.
I've got back questions here from
Okay, the distributed, the data models, whatever else, are all about distribution and not about central servers or about, so there's an issue about monetization. I mean, when you have the Oracles, the IBMs, the Microsofts coming in, and they're trying to build these things on their current centralized server type of models. How do you anticipate this is going to go forward? Do you see a battle between the small guys and the big guys?
That brings up something that actually everybody ignored, which is the trustworthiness models have existed for a long, long time. They're called banks. And they seem to have been able to find a way to monetize the trustworthiness calculation.
I'll take a stab at that one.
Sure, go ahead.
So one of the big questions that I have for the community in general is running a blockchain network on 2 or 3 different service provider clouds still a distributed ledger solution? Because the reality of the economics of the situation is that almost every major enterprise is putting most of their new stuff on one or more semi-public, hybrid, however you want to define it, cloud environments, whether it's IBM or Microsoft or whatever. If you look at what my company's doing or what Microsoft has done, my company has said, hey, you know what? Our supported distribution of Hyperledger with the additional things we call blockchain platform, you want to run it on AWS, it's available in the AWS store. You want to run it on Azure, it will be in the Azure store at the beginning of next year. You want to run it on Google Cloud, take your license to Google Cloud. You want to run it on-prem, run it on-prem. We don't care what hardware you run it in, it's packaged in Kubernetes so that it's containerized and packaged. So in that regard, the way we make money on the platform, quite frankly, is service and support. A Red Hat model will be, okay, it'll bring in a certain amount of income. After that, the applications, whether if we're talking food safety, those are t-shirt models. If you're a big company moving a lot of data and a lot of transactions, you pay for a large t-shirt. If you're a farmer only uploading data, you pay for a digital connection. If you're a distributor and you're only within one state and you're doing a minimal amount of stuff, you pay for a small t-shirt. And it's a software as a service model. And that's how that gets monetized. The data itself that's on there, he who put the data on and created the data owns the data. We're not selling your data. Okay? So if the farmer wants to sell, that'll break the genetics of IBM.
But there's lots of models, right?
Right.
I mean, you can run it there, but at the end of the day, if you're a miner, you're a validator, and you're running it on Bitcoin, Ethereum, Tezos, Dragonchain, you're getting paid for accounting. That's what it is. So there are little players. Everybody in this room could run a node and get paid. $68 million were paid out in some of the gaming platforms. That kind of monetization over the last year is available for others. Are there large opportunities to do it? Absolutely. This looks like EDI from the 70s. And there were aggregators who came along and did that and created it for the small players who then wanted to work with large big box companies, say a Walmart, Costco, BJ's. These models are well established. So yeah, there's lots of different ways.
Alex, I think you wanted to get in. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so one thought regarding on one of the regulations, but also the future, let's say, platform model. So, you may think this is a West Seattle accent or something, but it's actually it's a German accent actually. So when I think about Europe, for example, you think about the world from a European perspective, then you see that, of course, a lot of the core technologies, the platforms are either US entities or are Chinese companies, right? And I used to work for SAP. That's basically today the only thing that has, let's say, global importance, right, in the world of IT, right? So what I sense in Europe is that the European Commission and so on is on the one hand, of course, looking at regulating the big platforms and the core services that dominate our daily lives, and is maybe looking at blockchain technologies as a way to come up with next generation services that could basically shift the balance of power a little bit. The other thing, what I'm passionate about is I'm from Stuttgart. We always thought that we would work for Daimler one day. I ended up working for Bosch in the early days of my career. And when I think about a German engineer, actually for that matter, any engineer, right? They are great at building something to a specification, but they never think about how do I actually enable a business model? What's the outcome that this thing actually will create? And I worked actually at Microsoft, and I was part of the shift to the cloud, and I saw how difficult it was for Microsoft to make the shift to the cloud, right? Like Satya Nadella was my GM when I started at Microsoft, and then he moved on to pick the fight with Google when Steve Ballmer realized that Google is not a house of cards, as he liked to call it. And we all know how Microsoft struggled to actually make that transition to the cloud, and how Google still today is the dominant player in search, right? So when I think now, I work on the future of mobility, right? And so I think about autonomous cars, connected vehicles, and so on, and what does that mean for the future of Germany, where a lot of the industrial backbone is dependent on the automotive industry, right? So I see really, when you think about this question of like decentralization and so on, I really see the potential for all these machines to become miniature platforms, right? Where we can now establish this trust, transfer assets, and monetize also services that these platforms enable without any central intermediaries, right? And I always like to say, look, I would never go to Germany and tell these guys to build the next hyperscale cloud, because that's something that they are obviously not very good at, or it's also a lost battle, right? But when it comes to saying, look, an engineer there, you know, do you know what embedded systems are and stuff like that? Does it make sense to extend those now to a distributed ledger and really think about how can we monetize services and data that these machines generate and so on? I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah? So I think it's an opportunity for everybody who is not in the platform business to rethink business models and to create like a, you know, this digital future is a great opportunity for everybody. And I think distributed ledgers are a way to open it up for everybody to benefit from this digital revolution.
We'll go to Kate next, but I will point out that there is at least one German manufacturer that's in the cloud business. It's called Bosch. That's okay.
Because I think the question was about monetization models, and then we talked about private versus public blockchains. And I'm not going to be the most popular person on this panel, but I'm going to say that private blockchains are databases. They're not blockchains. If you cannot enforce immutability, if it's not distributed, it's not a blockchain, it doesn't mean there's no need for it. It's a necessary evil at the time of evolution where we are today, and there's no harm in IBM capitalizing and monetizing on that. But the future, the true power of blockchain is about enabling decentralization. So speaking of stories, that accent that you can hear was born and raised in Russia. And as you can imagine, opportunities in Russia are a little more scarce than they are in America. So my mother is a miner. She mines Ethereum. I know Ethereum is going to state, but for the time being, she's mining and she's generating revenue. There are thousands of examples, if not millions of examples like this in people in Mongolia, Venezuela, Brazil, and others, where they don't have the economic opportunity, but now they can participate in this economy that they couldn't participate before. So monetization is all about enabling the 99%.
Converting electricity to Bitcoin, or to Ethereum, sorry.
Sure.
So when we talk about centralization and distribution and cost, I think it's worthwhile to not discount the value of Moore's Law in this. And let's face it, Moore's Law has been going on for a very long time, and it's been terribly disruptive. There was someone from, I believe, was it IBM, who once, it's a famous quote that there might someday be need for possibly as many as 6 computers in the entire world.
16.
I'm sorry.
Can't remember his name.
Yes.
Yep.
So Moore's Law and the continuing advance of technology tends to degrade the costs, and that tends to cause a greater distribution of the ability to do the computing. You mentioned downloading a Bitcoin node and download 200 gigabytes of machine, and that's not something that can easily fit on an IoT device. Not today, I will say that. And it depends on the IoT devices, but again, if you look at the devices that we consider to be completely ubiquitous in our lives at this point, 10 years down the line, those devices are going to be considerably more powerful. And what we consider to be a baseline IoT device will be considerably more powerful at that point. At the same time, we can reasonably say, without any changes in the protocol, that the size of the Bitcoin distributed ledger is going to grow linearly, not exponentially. Computing power grows exponentially the data size grows linearly. It's just math.
It's a good point, although there are arguments that Moore's law has hit a brick wall, but we're not going to get into that today. There's a question over there that's been waiting for a bit. Sorry, Matt in the lecture. Mike?
Sorry, I thought you got something lined up. I didn't realise it.
I'm sorry. Who's got the hand up over there for next?
So you intrigued me with inherently saying that private blockchains are not distributed. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, on why you think that?
Yeah. The idea of the private blockchain is that you have a consortia of nodes, a consortia of corporations, a consortia of trusted parties who come together and decide on the version of truth that's going to be recorded on that blockchain. By definition, that's not public blockchain. It is private. It is within the boundaries of a specific number of nodes. Within that environment, you always have a third-party administrator who's going to be in charge of verifying the records on that blockchain. And then when you have a third party, anything, you always have tendency for corruption. And you can't enforce a tamper-proof, true blockchain. That is my perspective.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Go ahead.
Sorry. So are you familiar with Open Data Initiative? So what do you think about that? Because that's the incumbents coming back and saying, we've got data and we're going to take care of it. Isn't that more the same? Sorry. I think to Kate's point, if you don't have it completely out there and open for anybody to use and verify, it's a really slippery slope.
We have time for a couple more questions. There's one here. Let's see, Lars next.
So, question to the panel, and Kate, you may have insight on this, being formerly from Gartner. Gartner recently published a vision paper for companies just beginning to adopt blockchain and prototype applications for their use cases. They stated that out of those use cases that 90% will have to completely replace their existing infrastructure that they chose for those applications. So for those of us planning our infrastructure needs for blockchain, what are some of the best practices for how we plan for our operational needs given the changing landscape and emerging technologies?
I wasn't part of that report, but maybe I can comment on generally what I see the trends are within enterprises. So we've tracked 100 projects while I was still at Gartner, blockchain proof of concepts. And we found that 99% of them, specifically 99 out of 100, failed to achieve business outcomes that they intended to achieve in the first place. And the reason for that wasn't a technology problem. It was lack of alignment with business outcomes. It was lack of understanding what the problem was before you try to find a solution to that problem, and so forth. So maybe one question you wanted to ask was about business outcomes, which I think is extremely important when you think about an enterprise. Enterprises have two business outcomes. Let's keep it simple. One, generate more revenue, acquire customers, find more market share. That's number one. Number two is cut costs by means of efficiencies, removing intermediaries, and so forth. In the next 5 years, we're not going to see enterprises taking advantage of the first business outcome with blockchain because that requires complete overhaul. It requires them thinking in a decentralized fashion after they've been thinking in a centralized fashion for the last 50 years. It requires them thinking about tokens and incentives and game theory and things they're not familiar with. The second aspect of it, though, is a lot more immediate and a low-hanging fruit, in my opinion, for enterprises. And that does not require you overhauling your legacy technologies because all you have to do is think about the value chain. The value chain from the input to the output. How can you make that value chain more efficient and rethink your business processes and eliminate the inefficiencies? And for those purposes, you don't need to refresh your entire infrastructure stack.
Now, Steve, to that general point, I think one of the things that I've seen working with enterprises for decades at this point is that enterprises are slowly beginning to use the idea that they will need to change. And to your question about how they can prepare for this, it's plan for migration. Plan for migration. Enterprises are seeing this with a change from the on-prem computing resources to, okay, we're going to move to data centers. And they did that. Spent a lot of money moving their computing into data centers. And then they're moving to cloud. All of a sudden they're like, what happened to that fancy data center we're paying so much for, right? And now they're in cloud, and now they're in the process of moving towards containerization and software as a service. They're like, oh my God, we're paying all this for a license, but now we don't need that license that we've got. Like, all of this, the enterprises that are surviving and thriving in this environment are the enterprises that are planning for the migration process. Again, this is an aspect, it comes back frequently, Moore's Law. Moore's Law tends to make computing cheaper, and it means the efficient ways of doing your computing change. They just change from time to time. It opens up gigantic gaps in the ability of companies to efficiently operate. And companies that are not prepared to migrate their processes, migrate their data over to a new system, they run a gigantic risk of lagging behind and not having that. So companies need to get used to that.
You're saying you're screwed.
I
said it much quicker. We have time for one more question, then we've got to, I think it was...
And I think if there anybody hasn't asked a question before, or if not, you have, we would like something you have, right? I think, okay, you don't want to go to this? No, of course you don't want to. Because you sort of want to talk about your question.
No, it's just a question, but this question that we always ponder the decentralization and centralized. Because we seem to be a spider wrapping ourselves into this system. And you know, I've been exposed to so-called trade negotiations for a little while, and it seems like human self-interest always get into the way of getting things moving. And in Asia, actually, the government of Singapore and the government of Thailand, well, they help their farmers to do rise blockchain. And fintech is really what moving. When I just came back from Asia, wow, the energy level is so much more over there because their progress